I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank my colleague ministers, distinguished participants. I want to thank, in a particular way, the organizers of this conference for their kind invitation to me to be able to participate in one of the most challenging developmental factor facing mankind. Sustainable development, by its definition, implies you develop to meet the needs of the present without compromising the capacity of the future to meet their own needs. That is a challenge in itself. But I also want to commend them for choosing a more timely theme, attaining the energy, water, and food security for all. This trinity is the very foundation of sustainable development. Without it, it can't happen. And I want to echo my colleague Carlos's observation, the paradox in our continent. The African continent has a lot of paradoxes. The first paradox you mentioned was we meet least amount of warm greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we suffer most the consequences of this emission. What a paradox. There is a second paradox which I want to put on the table. The African continent is one of the most endowed continents on the globe, and yet it is one of the poorest continents on the globe. Think about it. In my own country, which I can use as an example without offending anyone, we call Uganda as a country gifted by nature. And in fact, in Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1908, he visited the African continent. In his book, My Journey to Africa, he observed, Uganda was such a country. You talk about freshwater lakes, they are there. Lake Victoria, Lake Edward, Lake George, Lake Wamara. And you talk about rivers, River Nile, one of the longest rivers flowing north, starts from Uganda. And the weather is so beautiful. In his observation, he said, you throw a seed, it grows without labor. And he called Uganda a country, he called it the pearl of Africa. And yet, Uganda, so endowed, is one of the least developed countries. How can you explain this? It's amazing. We have gold, we have uranium, we have oil and gas. And Uganda is still a member of the 49 least developed countries of the world. We must have a vision, and really this is the takeoff point. Our vision is that we must transform the African continent. We must transform Uganda from being a predominantly peasant subsistence economy to a middle-income country. And for that to happen, the theme of this conference is particularly relevant. We must not think in silos, as it was mentioned. If you take water, the centrality of water in transformation should be very obvious. You need water for human consumption, you need water for agriculture, you need water for livestock, you need water for fisheries, you need water for tourism, you need water for power generation. In our language, we call water bulamu, amazi bulamu, meaning water is life. If I translate the figures, just show you the irony of our time. We receive, as a country, 1,200 millimeters of rain annually. And yet, 35% of our population walk more than a mile to get to the source of water. And it becomes even a gender issue. Of those 35%, most of them are women and children. Looking at the location of Uganda, and indeed the African continent, we are right on the equator. The sun cuts across the continent just overhead. And yet when it comes to energy, only 14% of Ugandans have access to electricity. The rest of 86, they go to bed with sunset. And you are raising issues about population crisis. If 86% of your population are going to bed with sunset, what would you expect about the population? This is a compound connected issue that poverty, which is one of the limiting factors in transformation, is at the very heart of these two areas you have specified. You have 35% of your population traveling more than a mile to fetch water on a daily basis. If you put the opportunity cost, that one infringes on your economy. If all those had access to water, how much production they would have been doing. Similarly, when you have 86% of your population going to bed with sunset, how can you compete with the rest of the world who are working in shifts because they have electricity? And indeed, how can you increase accessibility of water if you don't have energy to pump it? Then how would you have food security when your whole agriculture is rain-fed and is dependent on hand-hoe? With no energy for value addition, you are locked up. So what is the way forward? Well, Madam Chair, I know the time is binding, is very constrained, but the first thing to do, in addition to the proposals, Carlos, you have put forward, I want to add the following as a way forward. First, the mindset. We must change the way we take development and we approach it. We must think out of the box. The mind change involves the people themselves. Development, sustainable development must be endogenous. The people, the African people, the Ugandan people, must feel a sense of dissatisfaction and a sense of urgency that the world is moving and we must be competitive. There is no way you can be competitive unless you really have energy supply. Competitiveness of doing business more efficiently, competitiveness of reducing costs of production, competitiveness of modernization ultimately hinges on your capacity to supply energy. That leads me to the second proposal, the question of science, technology, and innovation. Madam Chair, science is the cutting edge, really. The application of science and technology is the rock on which this transformation can take place. And consequently, the question of energy, again a paradox. Can you imagine a continent sitting on the equator? But most of the research in solar is done by those who are outside this opportunity. The African continent should be leading in energy research, particularly on solar. And indeed, application of even existing technologies, the application of existing technologies to improve the efficiency of producing commodities, adding value to our production. It must be done, and consequently, the policy issue becomes a real challenge. We must have institutions, we must have policies, we must have legal frameworks, and we must build capacities to transform our continent. And lastly, Madam Chair, transformation, to transform something. You mentioned it, structural transformation. To transform something must be holistic. You cannot just look at one dimension and you think you can transform society. No, the way we think, the way we plan, and indeed, we must show speed because the world doesn't owe us anything. It is us, and we can ask help, but ultimately it is our responsibility to do so. In doing so, the issue of climate change, which is a global issue, can only be solved by a global solution. And this is where I think the principle of common but differentiated responsibility remains a real challenge, and it would help. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.